The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, thank you for those of you who are attending via webinar today. Before we get started, we want to make sure that people can hear us okay. And how we can tell that is if you can raise your hand, that lets us know that you can hear us talking. Once we see a hand or two raised, then we can move. Okay, great. So if you want to lower your hand, that lets us know that you don't want to speak when we get to that point. Good morning again. It is 9 o'clock and the date is February 22nd of 2021. Welcome and thank you for attending the State Electrical Board and State Plumbing Board stakeholder meeting via webinar today. Before we get started, we would like to introduce the staff members from the Division of Professions and Occupations that are present. My name is Darcy Magnuson and I'm a regulatory analyst with the division. Also attending this meeting is Joyce Young, Program Director, Daryl Miller, Enforcement Unit Supervisor, and Elena Kemp, Regulatory Coordinator. We will be facilitating this stakeholder meeting. In compliance with governor's orders regarding COVID-19, the division has transitioned to a platform that is 100% virtual, and we appreciate your flexibility. As many of you have been to DORA stakeholder meetings before, we would like to reiterate the importance of your comments today. DORA makes decisions every day that may affect your life and your business, so your input is vital in the rulemaking process. Throughout this process, our goal is to create regulations that clarify and explain legislation, ensure minimum competency to enter and continue to practice, and provide only what is absolutely necessary for consumer protection without creating unnecessary barriers to the marketplace. Your input will be part of the information that goes to the boards as they consider adopting new rules to implement Colorado Senate Bill 2120 concerning new requirements for registered apprentices. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on each board's website by the close of business tomorrow. As the stakeholder meeting is held solely by webinar, please raise your hand by using the hand icon if you would like to speak, and we will unmute your line so you will be able to be heard by everyone. Or you can type your comment in the question section and we will read it aloud. Before we start taking comments, we want to ask that anyone providing comments, please state your name and who you represent. Feel free to provide either general comments regarding the questions, or if you want to provide the questions, that were provided to you in the notice for today's meeting, or if you want to provide specific language or feedback regarding the rules, you can propose new rules, you can do that as well. Try to limit your comments to no more than 3 to 5 minutes and try not to repeat something that was already said. But you are welcome to state if you're in agreement with someone else and we can note that. If you are using audio through your computer, please remember to put any phones on vibrate or turn them off. And whether you are using computer or phone audio, try to keep background noises to a minimum. Before we start taking comments, Joyce Young, the Program Director, would like to provide an overview of Senate Bill 2120 and will also be helping us guide the discussion regarding the questions that were sent to you in anticipation of today's meeting. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Joyce.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the stakeholder meeting. So this session will be very focused on a certain part of the Senate bill as it relates to the apprentice's requirement to take a licensure examination. So within the Senate Bill 2120, it requires that all apprentices who have been registered for 6 or more years will start taking licensure exams. For electrical, it's the Journeyman exam, and for plumbing, that would be the residential or Journeyman examinations. So whether they have the related education or experience verifications, they can start taking the examination. For electrical, that starts January 1, and for plumbing, that starts July 1, 2021. Part of the statute also allows for someone to seek an exemption to the, sorry, I'm trying to get to my materials here, to seek an exemption if they were unable to pass the examination within 2 examination cycles. And the cycles for the examination is the requirement requires that an apprentice, a 6+ year apprentice, needs to take the examination at least one within the board's designated renewal cycle. So for electrical and plumbing, or electrical, that runs on that 3-year renewal cycle for licensees, and plumbing that runs on that 2-year renewal cycle. It's a little bit less with the rollout, so it'll be about 2.5 years for electrical when they need to take the examination for the first time. So electrical apprentices will need to take the exam for the first time by September 30th of 2023. And for plumbing apprentices, it would be February 28th, 2023. So starting July for plumbing apprentices through February 28, 2023. The statute allows for that exemption if they have failed and taken and failed the exam within 2 of those cycles. So it would be the electrical would be that additional 3-year cycle, taking them out to, if they haven't passed it by September 30th, 2026, then they could apply for the exemption. If for plumbing, it would be February 28th, 2025, that they could apply for the exemption. So the statute also has the board establish rules that would allow for those exemptions, allow for the board to set rule to define what those exemptions would be and how they can how we would process those exemptions. So what we posed in our blast about this stakeholder meeting was the questions that, if we can get those displayed, the questions that we posed in our release of the stakeholder materials. So the statute allows for educational, legitimate or educational or professional circumstances would be subject for approval for those exemptions to take the examination. So what we want to get from stakeholders is what those exemptions look like. So our first question was, what do you think are legitimate educational circumstances that should be considered when approving an apprentice to waive the requirements in the bill to take the journeyman wireman exam or the plumbing examinations while holding their apprentice registration? This does not waive the requirement for the exam in order to get licensed. It just waives the requirement for the apprentice to continue taking the examination under the requirements of this bill. So again, it does not exempt the exam to get licensed. It exempts the apprentice from having to take this to get licensed. Sorry, question 2 notes the professional circumstances. So it's the same question as question one, but noting what professional circumstances. Oh, I'm sorry, on the educational circumstances as well, I do also want to note that our exam vendor, PSI, already allows for accommodations with the ADA. So those accommodations are most likely covered within the general allowances within the American with Disabilities Act for allowing for accommodation during examination. So just note that when you're considering the educational circumstances. And within those 2 questions, we also ask what documentation or proof might be submitted to the apprentice by the apprentice in order to adequately support the request. And then question 3 is, should the exemption for legitimate professional circumstances include licensed residential wiremen or plumbers who are registered as apprentices in order to obtain their commercial hours. So as most of you know, if you are licensed as a residential wireman or plumber, you may still be registered as an apprentice if you are attempting to obtain commercial hours to seek journeyman or master licensure. So that is what is called out in question number 3. And then if so, if you think there should be some exemption allowed for residential practitioners, what parameters should be considered in order to meet the intent of the bill? So those are our very straightforward questions on this, and that's what I'd like to really focus our discussion on today during this stakeholder meeting. So maybe if we could go back up to question 1 and see if we have feedback on the educational circumstances that should be considered when approving an apprentice to waive the requirements to take examinations while holding an active apprentice registration. And Darcy, I'll just open this up to if you want to facilitate that conversation with people who may want to comment.
I'm keeping an eye out on hands raised and written comments. We did receive one written question from Dan Hendricks that says, sorry about that, if a contractor will not verify the hours, then the apprentice should be able to bring a complaint against the contract. Also from Dan Hendricks, all legitimate educational disabilities are counted by the accommodations allowed by PSI.
Those are both accurate statements. Thank you, Dan.
A comment from Robert Gantz, what is an educational circumstance?
That's what we want to hear from the stakeholders. The statute allows for an exemption for a legitimate educational or professional circumstance, and we wanted feedback regarding what that educational circumstance may be. So think about your 6+ years apprentice, 6+ year apprentices. What educational hurdles may they have, or professional hurdles may they have, that would justify them not having to take, for them having to, being able to seek an exemption to the statutory requirement to start taking the journeyman examination after 6+ years of apprentice registration. So that's the real world. And we just want to get your feedback on those educational or professional circumstances.
We have a hand raised by Bruce Kranak. Mr. Kranak, you are self-muted, so now I've unmuted you on our end. You should be able to unmute on yours. You looks like you're good, Mr. Kranak.
Yes, good morning. I'm Bruce Kranak, and I'm representing plumbing, heating, cooling contractors in Colorado. And one of the things that we run into all the time with our Latino plumbers is the language barrier, and that the tests are not given in Spanish.
Okay, thank you. I saw your written comment on that as well. Is there anything else that you wanted to add at this point?
At the moment, no.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll go through some of the written comments that we've also received. So Sean Mayo, for electricians, if the apprentice has not met the 288-hour educational requirements.
Yeah, they would still have to take the examination. They just would not be licensed. So the bill in general requires the examination, requires those 6+ year apprentices to start taking the examinations, but they would not become licensed until they met all the requirements of the statute, of the whole statute for licensure. So it doesn't change the requirements for licensure. It just requires apprentices to start taking those exams if they have 6+ years of registration as an apprentice.
Okay, another question from Sean Mayo. Electrical apprentices this is for question 2, electrical apprentices that have not met the 8,000 hour requirement.
Yeah, same there. They would still need to take the examination, but they would not be considered for licensure until they met all requirements for licensure.
Okay, another question from Wayne Henkel. What testing accommodations are available for English as second language? English as a second language.
There are accommodations allowed for English as a second language. I believe that is Spanish right now, that they do have the additional time and the ability to have those materials available to them.
Okay, Dan Hendricks, the proof of a professional circumstance would be a filed complaint against an institution not verifying hours. Rich Thatcher, is it the classroom hours that they want to get out of?
No, they wouldn't be getting out of any requirement. So none of the requirements for licensure would be changed. This legislation only requires that apprentices start taking the examinations once they've gained once they've been registered as an apprentice for 6 or more years. So they would still have to have all the requirements for licensure prior to getting the license. They would just need to start taking the examination, and they'd be required to start taking the examination once they have 6 or more years as registration as an apprentice.
This is Elena. We also have a comment from Robert Gantz. Would that be also for special needs persons?
Those accommodations are covered through PSI in general. So they have ADA exam accommodations that they allow for within PSI in general.
Okay, another written comment from Mr. Dan Hendricks. Are the tests different for seeking a license and those just taking the test due to requirement? The PSI website has a test for apprentices with 6+ years.
It's the same examination. So it is just, we want to make sure that we can track those apprentices because of the requirements to take it at least once within each quote unquote renewal cycle. So there is that extra designation there. If someone is ready to take this journeyman's examination or residential or journeyman for plumbing, and they have their experience verifications, they have their education, they feel that they qualify, they can go ahead and select just the journeyman exam or the residential journeyman exams for plumbing, rather than selecting that apprentice requirement. So the exam is not different.
Okay, we have another written comment from Miss Marilyn Stansbury. Will Dora be doing anything for apprentices that are registered to communicate these requirements, especially as they get into their 4th year of registration, when they still have time to also get classroom hours for reaching the 6-year testing requirement? Or before reaching the 6-year testing requirement?
So we have currently we have sent out several e-blasts related to this, which you have likely also gotten. Those went out to all apprentices as well to outline the requirements for them to start taking the examination. But I do want to note that that is a really good point of doing that on a somewhat regular basis. It may be through an annual e-blast or something like that, but I think we definitely can consider that outreach to those apprentices.
Another comment from Mr. Frank Wolf. If an apprentice passes the examination but does not meet the requirements for licensure, does the apprentice need to retest when they have met all the requirements for licensure, or do they automatically obtain their license at that point?
They do not automatically obtain their license. So if they take the examination and they pass it and they believe that they meet the requirements, they review the statutes and rules and they have the correct number of hours as well as the required education, they make application to the state, to our division, and then their application would be considered. Just taking the examination does not qualify you for licensure, so you would still need to meet those requirements and make application to the state once you have met those requirements. There's no automatic licensure for anyone based on this statutory requirement. You would still need to meet the requirements and make application and have your application approved in order for your license to be issued.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have another comment from Mr. Dan Hendricks. He just forgot to introduce himself. He is Dan Hendricks from Denver Joint Electrical Apprenticeship. Thank you. And we have a lot of written comments here. I just want to remind everyone in the audience or that's on the webinar that you could also raise your hand using the hand icon, and we can unmute your line so you can speak and we can kind of bounce ideas off of each other. So that's also a way to participate. The next written comment from Mr. Kevin Hall. Is the 6-year timeable paused in the event of National Guard deployment circumstance? Or timetable, sorry. Is the 6-year timetable paused in the event of National Guard deployment circumstance?
You know, that could be an exception. Or an exemption, well, maybe not an exemption, but that could be something that we look at because it really is based on your apprentice registration. So if you're registered for 6 or more years, which the apprentice registration is completely controlled by the apprentice and their electrical contractor or plumbing contractor. So those times are definitely considered based on the registration period of those contractors. It would be, I'm sure we would consider something in writing regarding that, whether someone stays registered as an apprentice during National Guard duty. I have not heard of that, but it is definitely feasible and seems reasonable to consider.
We have another written comment from a Mr. Tony Husky. Will PSI communicate to the start on who test, or is it the responsibility of the apprentice to communicate with the state? All right. Will PSI communicate with the state?
So PSI will communicate the scoring. So as you may or may not know, PSI, typically if you're getting licensed and you're submitting an application, you do submit the information provided by PSI that you passed the examination. When it comes to these apprentices, the information will be downloaded from PSI. Again, so for tracking purposes, only so we can ensure that apprentices are complying with the requirement.
Okay. Another comment, written comment from a Mr. Josh Quintana. If a qualified apprentice fails both exams and does not receive an exemption, what happens to their status as an apprentice?
So they continue taking the exam every renewal cycle until they pass.
Looks like we have a comment from Miss Melinda Hernold. She's just introducing herself from Ridgeway, Colorado. Thank you. And Mr. David Miller, he has a question. What are the minimum hours for residential, journeyman, and master licensure?
You can find those on our website. It is within plumbing and electrical. You can go to our website and find out what the requirements for those hours, including education, are within the statutes. We also do have, if you go to the board's websites, you can get into the licensing information, and it does provide you some information in summary format within the board's licensure website.
Question from Miss Marilyn Stansberry. Even after receiving hours, what if an apprentice really doesn't want to be licensed in the career as a journeyman? It's JW. They have been an apprentice for a long, and it looks like the comment cuts off. I apologize. Let me scroll down so I can get the rest of it. Okay. What if the apprentice really doesn't want to be licensed in their career? They have been an apprentice for a long time, but don't want the added responsibilities that might come along with a licensed electrician. My concern with this is only discouraging someone who in reality does want to be licensed and is totally happy in that role.
Yeah, I definitely understand the comment and the question. The only way that they could waive the requirement to take the exemption is through what we're talking about today. What educational or legitimate educational profession circumstances should be considered when approving an apprentice to waive the requirements to take the examination. So that is kind of what what we're here to talk about today is, what do those requirements look like to you as stakeholders that would justify allowing someone to not take the examination? The intent is that the apprentices will use this as an apprentice program, and I believe the discussion around the legislation was whether apprenticeship is a career versus what a traditional apprenticeship is, and that it addresses the requirement for apprentices to start taking the examination, understand that by and large it is a career. The trade as an electrician or a plumber is a career where you would advance to licensure. So again, any exemptions to that would need to be sussed out as far as what legitimate educational professional circumstances might be relevant to exempt someone from taking the examination after those two cycles.
Okay, we've received another comment from Mr. Daniel Lee. At 6 years, I believe it's enough time for an apprentice to meet the requirements for a journeyman test. Can I get examples of why someone needs more than 6 years? I believe deployment should be allowed as a professional circumstance.
That is exactly what I would like to hear as well. So as the board is considering writing rules, it's not clear what those educational or professional circumstances might exist. And so that is one of the reasons we are reaching out to our stakeholders to get a better understanding of that.
Comment received from Mr. Rich Thatcher. What percentage of apprentices are we talking about?
I don't have that data. I apologize. I do not have that data right now.
From Mr. David Van Stel. Just to clarify, if you take the 6-year test and later acquire their required 288 hours of training, do they need to retest or just apply for their license with DORA?
They do not need to retest. They just need to apply for their license with DORA.
Mr. Dan Hendricks, he has a question. What if the apprentice doesn't take the test?
According to the bill, which is statute, they would be subject to have their apprentice registration inactivated or revoked.
Comment
and
from
there, let me just say, I'm sorry, let me just say there's a lot that would happen in between that. So the board could consider the status of the apprentice registration, which, you know, could be because we're quite a handful of years down the road from people actually violating this statute. It would be considered a violation of the statute, and it would be considered by the board for potential disciplinary action. They have a toolbox, whether that's they have a whole toolbox available to them to of discipline, whether that's a letter of admonition up to and including revocation of a registration. So it is, it's the full, it would be disciplinary action based on a violation of the law.
Comment from Mr. Rich Thatcher. We should bring back the requirement of if you fail the test twice, you need to take 16 hours of education. Thank you for that. I'm going on to, we have also another question from Mr. Joel Segura. Hello, this is Joel Segura with PPRBD. If the apprentice does not test, what will happen to their registration? And I think Joyce just gave a response to that. It could result in disciplinary action. We have another comment from Mr. Dan Hendricks. They just have to take the test. They don't have to apply to be a journeyman. Another comment from Mr. Dan Hendricks. At least I didn't see a requirement.
That's correct.
A comment from Miss Melinda Hinault. Western Slope PSI testing has been difficult for people who live in remote areas. Are there any plans to make it easier for those who live in remote areas?
We have not addressed that, and we hope, you know, that the circumstances in the coming months through this year will increase the availability will increase to allow for more test takers. And as PSI gets more test takers, one of their requirements with our office is that, you know, they try to make accommodation as the number of test takers increase. We, of course, do have some restrictions right now regarding the percentage of test takers in a room at the same time due to the COVID issues. But once that wanes a little bit and they are able to remove that as a factor, if we do see an increase of test takers based on this statutory requirement, PSI can consider opening more opportunities or providing more options, but it really is based on the number of test takers, and again, outside of the COVID restrictions that time period.
Elena, do you want to jump to hands raised? It looks like there are 4 hands raised if you want to call
Yes.
on that.
And I apologize. I just switched screens and noticed that we do have hands raised. Okay, so Mr. Dan Hendricks, I see your hand first. I'm going to unmute your line now. Oh, it looks like you're, wait. Oh, you're self-muted. There
Thank
you
you
go.
for that. Yeah, bringing all this back to the professional circumstances and the fact that there can be a detrimental effect for not taking the test, I believe you will have to allow deployment as a professional circumstance, if only due to the USERRA law. So I don't believe there can be any sort of detrimental effect to somebody who's deployed.
Yeah, and I imagine that would be around, thank you so much for that. And I do imagine that would be around the counting of the hours, the potential for the counting of the hours. That's my question. Are we talking about making that part of the exemption to require taking the exam, or is that just how we may be counting those 6+ years of apprentice registration?
I think it would just be the requirement to test. So if they are deployed at the time that they should be testing, and they can be deployed up through their 6th year, so they would have to be allowed a, exemption for that from taking the test. I'm not sure how you would do it with the hours that they are registered as an apprentice, unless I think somebody already suggested just a suspension during their deployment. But certainly for the requirement to take the test.
Right. That makes perfect sense.
I'm only going off what I've heard of other people say, though, and then putting that with the USERRA law. I don't think you would get away with any sort of detrimental effect to somebody that's deployed.
Yeah, and we definitely, in addition to that, we definitely want to support those individuals as much as possible.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to the next hand, and it looks like we have a hand raised by a Mr. Jeremy Ross. I'm going to unmute your line now. It looks like you're self-muted, Mr. Ross. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Hello, thanks. Good morning. Jeremy Ross, representing IBEW Local 68. There was significant conversation around deployment, National Guard reservist deployment when it came to this bill, and including that as a professional circumstance. And the conversation at the time was really around basically if they were deployed for a year and had evidence and proof of that deployment, then that year would be taken out of the 6-year requirement, right? So it would basically extend their 6-year requirement to 7 years. So, to the point, I think when you were talking about how those hours are counted and then when they would be required to take that test, that was what the conversation was at the time, when crafting this bill.
Great. And I would ask you for any other feedback you might have regarding this allowance for the exemption. And then also more specifically on the deployment, I assume there was probably discussion about actually taking the exam. So let's say they had that 6+ years and there wasn't any deployment during that 6+ years. But now that they have the examination, the requirement to take the examination, that they might receive a temporary exemption for the examination, or was there discussion about a full-on exemption while they're deployed?
Yeah, I think it would be a temporary exemption while they're deployed. Obviously, we can't to Dan's point, we can't penalize them while they're on deployment, nor do I think anyone would want to.
Right.
If they're out, doing their job, serving this country, that would be counterproductive for us to penalize them for doing so. And so the intent, I think, was to give them the temporary exemption while they were on deployment. And under that circumstance that you just laid out, right? They get deployed at 5 years and 9 months into their apprenticeship, and then they're on deployment when that 6-year anniversary comes up. There would be no need for us to hold that person, penalize that person for that. And so when they, theoretically, when they got back, they would have to contact the department and say, hey, I was on deployment. Here's my documentation that I was on deployment. And then, you would figure out accommodations from there.
Yeah, we could probably set in rule, how long after returning from deployment, and then maybe provide a catch-all of, or as approved by the board, because if someone comes back with an injury, you may not want to have the same requirements as, just someone who ends their deployment time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, the other thing to consider too is that, when you get 6 years, if you're 1 month into a new renewal cycle, then, you still have 3 more years to have, or, whatever, 2 years and 11 months to take that test for the first time. Right. And so these scenarios are going to be far and few between where they actually get caught up in this, in this conundrum. Because realistically, like I said, if your 6-year anniversary is 1 month into a new renewal cycle, then you have all kinds of time. Now, if your 6-year anniversary comes in the last year of a renewal cycle, then that's a whole other conversation, right?
Right.
So I think, I don't see any reason why, I think it would be illegal, to Dan's point, to penalize those people that were on deployment. But also, there would be no reason to do that. And certainly if they came back with an injury and needed, an extended amount of time to take care of that, that would be an accommodation that I think would certainly would fall under the professional circumstances. And you would give them the time necessary, to go through their rehab and get back out there.
And I'm wondering too, Mr. Ross, if you have any thoughts on the educational circumstances that might exist.
So I know there was some comments earlier about English as a second language. There was testimony on that during the bill, or, when it was going through committee. And there was an understanding that, PSI was already giving circumstances for English as a second language. And then as long as other, educational disabilities or learning disabilities. And so, I don't know what those, educational circumstances would be beyond that. But that one I think is a little tougher, and we'll have to have some conversation around it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, looks like we have another hand raised from Mr. Rich Thatcher. I'm going to unmute your line now. Hello?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes, we can hear you. Good morning.
Yeah, a couple things to kind of dovetail on with that, the comments for the deployed. Don't we already have in statute for the journeymans that, or at least a similar language when somebody's deployed and for the renewal of their license? Doesn't it get put into kind of a holding pattern so they're not They don't have to do anything, you know, like take the test again because they missed their renewal. Is that in statute?
Daryl, do you know the, he's kind of my application guru on this, the military, any accommodation for the military regarding renewals and those types of things?
Not specifically spelled out in statute, Joyce, but around deployment or exercises in the military. I know that those have been taken into consideration in the licensing offices, also in the board program as well.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, even if it is not written in statute or rule, I can tell you that, you know, the board as well as the division, you know, takes service seriously and makes every accommodation to try and ensure that, you know, deployment is taken into account if there are any issues with renewal or reinstatement. It's definitely something we focus on to allow for.
Yeah, I could have sworn there was actually something in there regarding exemptions for military personnel.
I'll take a look here real quick and as we go on, see what we have.
Another, while we're talking about statute, does it say in statute that anywhere that an apprentice does have to take the test? Or is that just an assumed after they're, you know, they've completed their time? Or does it say somewhere that they're required to go through the process to get their license?
One of the requirements for licensure is passage of the examination. So that's for anybody, presumably apprentices. But so this statute typically addresses those who have chosen not to seek licensure and so not taken the examination.
But that's what I'm asking though. Is there anywhere that states that they have to go for their license? Because if not, maybe that's something we should put in there.
It is not.
Okay, so that's kind of the loophole they're utilizing then.
So you mean if they just want to take the exam every 3 years?
Or not take the exam, period. If we don't have anywhere that states they have to go through the process to get their license.
Yeah, so if they take and pass the examination, there's no requirement for them to get the license. There's just the requirement to take the examination.
Oh, so it is in statute that they have to. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, this new Senate bill requires them to take the examination if they have 6 or more years of apprentice registration. For just a normal person, a normal apprentice going through the process that has, you know, 4 years of apprenticeship and some additional education, maybe they would apply for licensure, and taking the examination would still be a requirement for licensure.
Because I know we have, you know, language that the contractor has to be licensed, but we don't have any language that an individual would have to be licensed to do electrical work after their quote unquote apprenticeship hours.
If you're licensed, if you're licensed, or if you're performing work, you would need to have a license. If you're performing work as an apprentice under a contractor, you're required to have a registration. And then once you've met the requirements for licensure, you may or may not apply for licensure. But as long as you're an apprentice, you have to be under the supervision of a licensee, right, and registered through your contractor.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up real quick on the military, it does allow experience within the statute only it talks about allowing for military experience to be counted as experience, but it does have to be electrical work. So that is what is in statute about the military experience.
Yeah, I actually wasn't regarding for the experience side of it. I was actually dovetailing from what everybody was talking about, allowing them to increase that time frame, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, whatever the case is, to extend their, instead of 6 years, we extended another year because of that military time off.
Oh, okay. So you're thinking within the new law, it may have had that. Yeah, I don't see in the statute where it discusses that as part of the law allowing for that, but it is definitely a good way moving forward when it comes to the rulemaking, which is allowed for in the new bill.
Yeah, I was just thought we already had it for the renewal side of it, and we could use that same language for this piece.
Oh, okay. Let me look at I don't show anything in statute or rule regarding that, but there may be standard division language. So that would
Joyce,
actually.
I'm in that now, Joyce. I'll take a look for you.
Oh, thanks. So I checked statute and rule and I don't see anything, but there may be some standard division language for all our licensed professions about renewal during deployment. So we'll definitely look into that, because if we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that would be just dandy.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. The next hand we have raised, we might want to kind of toggle back and forth because we do have a lot of written comments. We have a written comment from a Miss Alyssa Soares. Are there financial considerations or assistance for testing? That's our first question. Especially if an apprentice needs to test every cycle but will not receive licensure because they cannot meet the requirements. Say they work for a company that only provides residential services, or they only want to work in the residential side, so they cannot gain commercial electrical hours.
So on the plumbing side, it would allow for them to become a residential plumber. On the electrical side, it does require the Journeyman examination, but that's what I'm wondering as far as the exemptions. But it would be, we would need to draft the rules to make sure that we did capture those doing only residential, because a lot of residential, maybe a lot is an overstatement, but my understanding is that a good amount of the residential are also registered apprentices in order to obtain their commercial. Okay. But it is, I think it's one of the questions we pose is, do you want to capture those doing just residential in the exemption? And if so, how would we do that? Or what are your thoughts on how we might capture those doing just residential?
We have a comment from a Miss Marilyn Stansbury. Deployment seems like a reasonable exemption. A question from Mr. Rich Thatcher. Does it say in statute that we must take the test to remove them from the apprentice list? I'm not quite sure if you answered that earlier, Joyce, but we could always circle back or provide.
Can you read that one more time for me?
Sure thing. Does it say in statute that they must take the test to remove them from the apprentice list?
It does not explicitly say that in statute. It requires them to become licensed in order to remove them, for them to be removed from the apprentice list. And it is the responsibility of the contractor to remove their apprentices from the apprentice list within DORA.
Okay. Just a couple more comments, and then I'll switch back to everyone that's on the webinar with their hands raised. Another question from Miss Marilyn Stansbury. If they don't have apprentice education hours, they do have the required OJT hours and pass the Journeyman test, are they subject to the 24 hours of required CEUs?
I would refer to the statutes and rules related to this. I really want to focus on the apprentice exemptions regarding them taking the examination based on the requirements of Senate Bill 2120. So I would just refer you to the either the statutes and rules and the licensing page within the board, or you can email our board office with those specific questions and we'll get them taken care of.
Yeah. Another question from Mr. Tony Husky. Would a learning disability qualify for an educational circumstance?
Currently, we're not talking, we don't have anything specific noted because PSI already makes those accommodations, and it is within the American Disabilities Act regarding those, and PSI has more information regarding those general exemptions. So outside of PSI's accommodations, I apologize, not exemptions. Outside of PSI accommodations, we haven't spoken of anything else today.
Okay.
Because it's pretty much understood that PSI handles those ADA accommodations, and by all evidence that we have, they do that pretty successfully.
Okay, I'm going to go back to some of the hands raised. Mr. Roy Crabtree, I'm unmuting your line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call.
Absolutely.
My question is regarding at the end of the 6-year cycle for electricians, which you're required to take the exam twice in the 6-year cycle as an electrical apprentice that's completed 6 years and has not become licensed. Is the intent to offer a special lower the bar exam, or to exempt the person from continuing to be a registered apprentice? I'm unclear as what the exemption is.
Your second statement is correct. It is not waiving the requirement for the exam to be licensed. It would be the consideration that we are talking about today would be what the stakeholders believe the exemption should be for an apprentice to continue being an apprentice, but be exempt from taking the examination every cycle.
Okay, so it essentially legitimizes where we are right now with the statute, because right now an apprentice electrician can continue being employed as an apprentice electrician indefinitely. This inserts a legitimacy to that once they have taken the examination twice in a 6-year period. Then they can apply for essentially what you're saying is a lifetime exemption. They can just go the rest of their career and never test again and never become a journeyman, yet they will have the legitimacy of an apprenticeship registration with the State Electric Board. Am I correct?
It is working to define if that is what circumstances that would be appropriate, yes.
And what circumstances would not be appropriate?
Just the basis for the legislation altogether. So the legislation requires that those individuals take the examination every cycle. And so what I think, are you saying, are we looking toward an overall exemption for everyone that fails the exam twice within that those exam cycles? Is that what you mean?
I am not. What I'm asking is, this person takes the examination twice in the 6-year period specified.
Right.
After the second examination, they do not pass. What are the alternatives? What does the exemption mean? Does it mean I apply for it and I'm allowed to go the rest of my career without testing again? Or am I allowed, or am I required to test again every cycle, every 3-year cycle? I continue testing. Whether I pass or not, I stay as a registered apprentice.
So it would be based on whatever rules are established. And so what we're talking about today is, like we discussed with the professional circumstance, right? We are talking about an exemption around the deployment. So that is a finite period of time. So are there other circumstances that would make it a lifetime exemption? That's the question that we're trying to get from this stakeholder engagement with the representatives, all of you here. We're trying to understand if there are those exemptions that exist that might qualify for exemption, a blanket exemption, or are there other considerations for the educational professional circumstances that might have a limited exemption period. So we're open to hearing all of those ideas and suggestions.
Well, I'm not sure I'm making myself clear here, so I'll try to explain it a little bit differently. My question is, we have a number of people in the electrical industry who, for one reason or another, are not going to pass that journeyman's exam. It would appear that first step is we are forcing them to take that exam at least twice in a 6-year cycle, or lose their apprenticeship status. Am I correct?
That is the language in the statute.
Okay. So they're being forced to take the test and not continue on as indefinite apprentices or helpers, as it may be. So if they do not take the examination at least twice in the 6-year period, they will lose their status, and the contractor will not be allowed to legally, by statute, continue having them in their employment. Am I correct?
That is somewhat correct, but what the statute does allow is for the board to enact rules that allow for a legitimate educational or professional circumstance that would allow the apprentice to continue practicing without taking the examination.
Okay, so that's the exemption we're talking about, which I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, and so if you have ideas on what might assist or might be reasonable exemptions, that is also appreciated. But I do also want to note that if they do not take the examination, that is when the board's authority comes into play regarding their apprentice registration. So if they continue to take the examination every cycle, once they pass, they don't need to take the exam any longer. Otherwise, they need to take it every cycle until they do pass, whether they become licensed.
Right.
So
well, very good.
Yeah.
If I understand that right,
yeah.
Because obviously if they pass the examination and they have the time in, they become licensed to journeyman, and this is all a moot point. If they do not pass twice, they can go on every 3 years and take the exam. They retain their apprenticeship registration status. The exemption is if they wish to apply to, say, in effect, I'm not going to pass this exam for whatever reasons, or I don't want to pass the exam, that would be up to the board to look at that. And all that exempts them from is taking the exam every 3-year cycle. Am I correct?
That is what the statute reads currently, yes.
Very good. Does not provide an easier path to licensure. Does not provide a, for lack of a better term, dumb down or lower the bar exam.
Right.
It just allows them to quit testing every 3-year cycle.
Correct.
Very good. I have exactly the answer I needed there.
Well, I appreciate you sussing it out because it's really important information regarding them continuing to take the examination, which we hadn't really talked about yet. So I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Okay, so the next hand we have is from Mr. Scott Pandy. I'm going to unmute your line. It looks like, okay. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Well, how are you?
Good. I appreciate the dialogue, and I concur with a lot of the concerns the last gentleman just had. I'm kind of taken back a little bit. I'm looking at some of these, this House bill and how it got passed and whatnot, and it's more. I've got some questions on it, and I'm kind of concerned where we're at with the industry right now, where we're compelling these apprentices, which are the lowest compensated individuals, if you will, in our industry as it applies to electrical. I'm a master electrician, 40 years, electrical contractor, and actually I'm the past vice chair of the electric board. And I've kind of been out of pocket a little bit dealing with more of the national politics, if you will, that we've all had to go through here lately. And so I'm kind of getting up to a little bit more on speed on what's going on here. And we've sure put on a lot of pressure on the electrical contractors, it seems to me here, which they are compelled to register individuals working in this industry, which they need, and we need in here working, and they are being complicit in doing that. But then we're telling them, if you don't test out here, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be in jeopardy of being in violation, of going further. You're going to have additional costs. And I just have a lot of concerns on where we're going in the industry when we're compelling them, because we don't compel a journeyman to go take a master's test and have to go test over a certain period of time. And I'm just trying to understand what we're trying to achieve here. And it puts a lot of pressure on the board too, because you're looking here, and I appreciate you reaching out. What are the professional circumstances, right? What are we looking to do to give them a hall pass? I don't think anyone's trying to give them an easier, dumbed down test that was mentioned here before. I think that would not be what we're looking for, but we certainly don't want to discourage individuals from coming in to the industry that are already financially strapped, most likely, and then telling them, especially if the company won't pay for it, for them to test out. I've just got a lot of concerns here, and I don't know if there's any dialogue that there is we can modify this somehow.
Darcy or Elena, if you want to talk about the legislative versus the board's role, I would appreciate that.
Sure, so I can talk a little bit about that, and hopefully I understood the question correctly. But at this point in time, what the board is charged with is to implement the legislation. So we can't do anything to change the legislation. The board just has to, through rulemaking, has the authority to clarify and explain the legislation.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. So is the board able to then, as they interpret this, is the board able to not basically what the guy was saying, this person doesn't have to go and pay a fee every code cycle to go test out, because maybe they just want to be a lifelong apprentice, and the electrician, electrical contractor, if you will, needs these people to be employed there, but that's not their career goal. That's not something they want to go do. Maybe they, they're doing this in conjunction with something else, as a vocation.
So the fee is collected by PSI, and so the board doesn't really have control over those fees for the examination. I don't see a pathway for the board to be able to waive those fees for apprentices that are required to take it past, waiving those fees for apprentices to take the examination.
Sure. Well, I can question too the professional circumstances. So would it be practical then that if they've taken it once and twice, that the apprentice submits documentation saying it's financially a burden, and secondly, because their company won't compensate it, and secondly, that it's not their desire to become a journeyman, but they still want to work within the industry? Would that be something that would be acceptable?
I'd like to hear feedback from the other stakeholder. I'm not sure that's the intent of the statute necessarily, for someone to waive it because they want to be apprentices. It doesn't seem like the statute is necessary. If that is the intent, would be for apprentices to continue to be apprentices. My understanding is a lot of this conversation was around the concept of apprenticeship, that the concept is that apprenticeship is not a career path. Licensure is the career of an electrician, and that apprenticeship is just a portion of that career path. So I'd be interested to hear some feedback from others regarding that, but definitely take note of what your idea is, Mr. Pandy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a hand raised by Mr. Sean Mayo. I'm going to unmute your line. Good morning.
The last gentleman there, good morning. The last gentleman there pretty much took the words out of my mouth. That was my biggest concern here too, is that, I've heard it mentioned a couple times that the apprenticeship isn't a career, and it can be a career for some guys. There's guys that don't want to test out for whatever reason it may be, and if they're fine with the lower wage and working with somebody else, then who are we to force them to go take a test? Now, the other side of this is, we've got a couple guys working here. I'm an operations manager for an electrical contractor here in Denver. And we've got a few guys working here that started later in life. They're in their 30s. They've got kids. They've got families. It's hard for them to go take classes in the evenings after they've worked for an 8-hour day. It's one thing when you get into the trade young, you're motivated, you've got the time. 6 years is plenty of time to get a license if that's what you want to do. When you get into this job later, it's a lot harder to go back and take those classes in the evenings for several, a couple of years if you take a fast track program. And it just makes it, I feel like we're forcing some guys to, you're almost discouraging them, because we've got guys that have the hours, but they don't have the training. They don't have the 288 hours of education, and they're not able to get that at the moment. So for these guys, for them to go take a test, for one, they got to take a day off work. So now that's money out of their pocket to go spend 4.5 hours taking a test that is not going to further their career in any way, because they're not qualified for that journeyman license. So they're going to go in, they're going to write their name on the test, they're going to turn around and leave. Meanwhile, this costs them money in the meantime. And it's just, you're not furthering their career any by forcing them to take the test. Same with a journeyman license. Well, the next step is a master, so now do you force your journeymans to go take their master's license test to get their master's? I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with the whole law to begin with. I know it's already passed and here we are, but I think we need to, maybe before any of this, an exception would be if you don't qualify for a journeyman's test, you're not required to go take the test. That might eliminate some of that. As far as the hours, we've got a guy working for us right now that he started as a senior in high school, and he was using this as an internship to count for some of his high school credit for a program he was taking there. And so, got into the trade, good, sharp kid. This is what we need in the trade right now, is young people coming into it that actually want to do it. Well, he worked for us for a full year, registered as an apprentice, because that's what we have to do as a contractor. And he was only working 1 day a week for us because he was in school the rest of the time. So, to jump back on some of the examples that some folks were asking for earlier, I mean, there's two right there that it's just my company, and I've worked with a lot of other companies, and it's the same. Unless you come up through the IC or come up through the IBEW, that schooling isn't provided right off the bat. It's something you've got to do on your own. So, sorry for the long-winded comment there. That's just kind of where I'm at with it.
That's much appreciated. I do want to note that the bill included individuals who do not meet the qualifications. So the bill does require those who have not met the requirement, who have met the licensure requirements. It does require them to take the examination as well.
Right.
So it would be difficult for the board to circumvent the intent of the statute through the rules, and the rules are pretty specific related to these exemptions. So that's kind of where the struggle is going to be, is identifying those areas where there may be some reasonable options. So keep it coming, keep commenting, and I really do appreciate your feedback.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to jump back to a couple of written comments.
Hey, Darcy and Joyce, I do have a military update if this is a good time to circle back to answer that question.
Sure.
Joyce? Yes, so in statute, we do currently have an exemption for active military personnel. It's an exemption from the licensing requirement. It's Article 122302. And in short of going through the whole article, it specifically looks at deployment and military service. I believe it's over 100 days. And it goes on a little bit more in depth, but looks like we have that language already in statute, Joyce.
Oh,
and, stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Yeah, that is, we've somewhat recently separated out some of the general requirements, and that is where I missed that separation within, it's outside of our typical electrical and plumbing statutes. So it is within Title 20. So I apologize that I missed that. Thanks so much, Daryl.
No problem.
Okay, so jumping back to some written comments, we had a comment from Miss Melinda Hinold. Is there any way to do remote testing? I'm not sure if you want to address that now, or maybe
that hasn't been established at this time. PSI is not doing remote testing.
Okay. Comment from Mr. Joel Segura. I don't believe a language barrier should be a circumstance to exempt the requirement. Comment or a question from Mr. Robert Gantz. Does it make sense that if an apprentice decides not to take the test or not to become a journeyman, but wants to stay in the trade, can they be put into a hold at the 6-year mark as a professional circumstance?
I apologize. Can you read that one more time for me?
Does it make sense that if an apprentice does not want to take the test or does not want to become a journeyman, but he does want to stay in the trade, can they be put into a hold at the 6-year mark as a professional circumstance?
I'm wondering, does that mean hold as an apprentice, that they're no longer an apprentice? I'm not clear on that. If you want to maybe comment or provide some feedback on that, or maybe speak to it.
And that was from a Mr. Let me see if he's still on. He is. Well, maybe we should circle back around. Mr. Gantz, if you do want to provide a little more clarity on that question, we can unmute your line and you can address that so we can try to provide some answers.
Yeah.
But we'll circle back. I'll keep checking to see if he does raise his hand. All right, the next question or comment is from Daniel Lee. When the plumbers are required to take the educational hours like the electricians, or will the plumbers be required to take the educational hours like the electricians? That's question number one.
I don't have anything pointing to that requirement or not. I'm not privy to whether that's coming or not.
Okay. He also says in this comment, I think a set amount of educational hours should be met for a set amount of time, like you have for the journeyman's and master's licenses. Thank you for that. Another questions and couple comments from Mr. John Newberg. If you want apprentices to take tests after 6 years of registrations, but they don't have to take, or they don't have their hours of schooling and don't have to apply for a journeyman's license, what is the purpose? Why not just require continuing education for apprentices? We need good apprentices in the trade as well as journeymen. It seems like the changes that are being made are gearing things towards a more unionized type of system.
I wish I can comment on that, but the board wasn't part of the legislative process. Those were done, the statute changes were done through the legislative process. So I really can't answer the intent behind the subject you're discussing. I apologize. I don't have that available to us in the board office.
Question from Mr. David Miller. Under the statute, are employers required to report hours for 6+ year plumbing apprentices to DORA? And if so, when does this begin?
So part of the statutory requirement within the bill will require this to take place, and we'll be looking at those in the coming year regarding the intent is that we would have a more streamlined approach for contractors to be able to provide those hours on an annual basis to update individuals' records. So that is coming up in the statute later on. Let me take a look here real quick, if I can. It's different for electrical and plumbing. So for electrical, it is January of 2022, and each January thereafter, the electrical contractors would be required to do that, and the plumbing is July 1, 2022, where the contractors would be required to update their apprentices' hours by July of each year, requiring that they make sure that their registration is either the hours are entered and or the apprentice registrations are they have their end date attached to them. And we will have more of that interaction regarding that issue coming up in the coming months.
Thank you. All right, another comment from Mr. John Krako. When someone gets deployed for a year, the contractor should be required to inform the state the apprentice is not working, the same way they are required to report whenever an apprentice is no longer employed by them.
Mm-hmm.
And another question from Ms. Marilyn Stansbury. Would it be necessary to include specific exemptions in the regulations or just refer to the existing federal guidelines that apply to military service and deployment?
I think it's important, especially for apprentices, to have that information available within the rules of the board, because they would be the board's rules related to that, and those temporary exemptions would be related to the stakeholder engagement and the board's adoption. So I do think the specifics are important to be in the board's rules as allowed in the bill.
Okay. Another comment from Ms. Marilyn Stansbury. We should honor, recognize, and not penalize anyone who has work or schooling time interrupted due to deployment. Comment from Ms. Melinda Hinold. If remote testing was available, it would be possible for testing from anywhere. We have a comment from Mr. Phil Hayes. We have a long launch window here. It would be critical for contractors with 6+ year apprentices will need to play a role helping to educate their apprentices of these new requirements. Thank you. Another comment or a question from Bryce Hannah. How does this affect plumbing and electrical apprentices employed in the state classified system?
I think anyone registered as an apprentice with the board is subject, according to the statute. It is any apprentice registered with the state. So that is the authority within the statute.
Okay. Another comment from Bryce Krenak. My understanding is that PSI just allows more time, not Spanish. A comment from Mr. Phil Hayes. The educational circumstances language was meant to give flexibility to the board to create rules around extenuating circumstances that may prevent or create barriers for apprentices to comply. ESL was one part of that discussion. Access to readily available classroom training was discussed. All right. We're going to go ahead and switch back. We have a couple hands raised, and I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak. And we are, it's currently 10:28. So we have about 30 minutes, and just want to make sure everyone has time to talk. Okay, Mr. Eloy Martinez, I see your hands raised. I'm going to unmute your line. Hello?
Yeah, I was, a lot of the questions that have been asked, I've got some answers from, but I'm still thinking about the deployment. I have several people that are in the military right now, and every time they get orders, they go off to do their thing. Now, how is that counted? How do they get their 8,000 hours towards their journeyman? How does that affect that?
So the
Every time
hours
they're
that,
deployed.
yeah, the hours that qualify for licensure are hours that they're doing electrical work. That may be included within their deployment hours, or it may be just included. I mean, it's up to the master to determine, or it's up to the contractor to determine the hours that they are providing experience verification for.
Right.
You know, it calls out how many hours were spent in residential or how many commercial and
Sure.
industrial, those types of things. So it is really up to the contractor to report the hours that they were performing electrical work. And then again, supplementally, if they were doing electrical work as part of their the work in the service,
Deployment.
that could also qualify. But
So
that
just,
would be, it wouldn't be something that the contractor would it wouldn't be something that the contractor would necessarily, they should not be reporting that. It would be through their records of service. Their service records should
Okay.
have that information. And so
I
they
think
would
that
just
answers.
submit that as part of their application.
Okay, I think that answers my question. So if they're deployed and doing electrical work, they would just need a record of that.
Right, because you want the, you know, the intent of that experience is that, you know, there's this determinate amount of hours that are required
Sure.
to say that you've done that amount of hours to qualify you to become licensed. So it is the true working hours that you're doing electrical work.
So just because they're deployed, if they're not doing electrical work, then none of those hours would count towards their license, correct?
Right, if they're not doing electrical work, yeah.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to the next hand raised, and that is by Mr. Jeremy Ross. I'm unmuting your line.
Thank you. So I just wanted to add a little bit of information from some of, you know, a couple of the earlier comments. So earlier, a gentleman asked about what percentage of the apprentices are we talking about. So I don't have the current numbers with the exact number, you know, as of today. But when we were crafting the legislation last year, there were 12,580 apprentices registered. Of those, 4,896 of them, or 39% of all apprentices, were over 6 years. And then 1,359 of the apprentices were between 4 and 6 years. So there was a significant number, I think it was 49%, or 6,168 of the apprentices that were registered had more than the 4 years required to take the test and become journeyman. So just to add a little bit of information, you know, clarification to his question earlier. And then
and if I can just piggyback on that, after the legislation came down and we started this implementation process, we did go through and take the apprentice registration of the journeyman level and higher and ensure that if there were apprentices registered, that we terminated those registrations if you had a journeyman or higher license, journeyman or master license, in order to make sure that that number is closer. So it might be good to for us to try and get some current numbers on that as well.
Okay, good clarification, thank you.
Yeah.
And then there was a conversation not only in committee, but as we went through this legislative process about the I don't want tos. You know, I just don't want to take a test. I don't want to become a journeyman. And I think overwhelmingly it was agreed that it was not a professional circumstance to just not want to do it. You know, I think the overall understanding when you get into these trades is that they're licensed trades, and that you go through an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship, is typically defined as a training, a time frame to be trained in a certain industry that has a specific time frame at the end of it. And Colorado has, the legislation for electrical says 4 years. So to see that we had, apprentices at the time that were registered that had, 30 plus years in the trade as an apprentice, was one of the things that we considered. And so, I think that, that point was well talked over in the process of creating this legislation. The journeyman to master, conversation, I think, is a bit of a false equivalency, because a master is really only if you want to go on to become a contractor. Well, it's not assumed when you get into this trade that you're going to become a contractor. Some people do it, some people don't. But that's really the place for a master's license. And if I understand correctly or remember correctly, even a double E, an electrical engineer can go get a master's license and become an electrical contractor. So it's not quite the same thing. A journeyman classification is the productive classification in the field.
Right, and that's great information too. I didn't touch on that as part of the comment, so I appreciate you covering that as well. And I would say, the apprentice is a supervised position, where it is a supervised individual. It is a registration versus a license, and so individuals who are licensed as journeymen or licensed as masters, they have certain rights to their license, whereas apprentices are a registration form of registration rather than a duly licensed individual. So it is, again, piggybacking on that somewhat false equivalency between a registered apprentice and a duly licensed electrician.
Absolutely. And then, the conversation about, the reporting of the hours was really around, individuals having a hard time getting their hours documented on affidavits. Maybe they were given them at a point in termination, or maybe they weren't. But, several years goes by, and then they go to try to take a test. And I think, as most of us know on this call, the majority of people that attempt to be contractors don't succeed. And so they may have done those hours under a contractor that's no longer around, and they can't get these hours documented. And so the point was to have contractors document those hours to DORA on an annual basis, so that an individual can contact DORA when they're ready, and the DORA will have those hours documented for them, so they don't have to run around and either keep track of hours for 4 to however many years, now with this legislation, 4 to 6 years, keep track of those hours, but also, if they didn't keep track of them, to have to go back and try and find contractors that may not even they may not even exist anymore. So that was kind of some of the background with doing the reporting. And then my final piece for this session, at least, is on the residential, the conversation about if somebody holds a residential license and an apprenticeship application. I think if the intent is for that individual to stay in the residential realm of the industry, then why would this apply, right? It wouldn't apply, because they wouldn't, why would they carry a registration for an inside to collect hours on the inside if their intent is to remain in the residential sector of our industry? If they go and register as an apprentice and keep their residential licensure, then I think the same rules apply, right? I mean, you're an apprentice. If the intent is to collect hours to become a journeyman wireman and to you know, I guess progress your career in the commercial industrial side of our industry, then I think the same rules should apply to that registration, right? That if they're working in the commercial and industrial side of our industry, then, you know, they're going to be collecting hours under that, and at some point in time there will be a requirement to test.
Thank you. On the residential side, I have a question about, because you probably went through all iterations of this during the discussions, but when it comes to a residential wireman who, should those 6 years of apprentice registration, they would have had to have been registered to become a residential wireman. So was there discussion about that 6 years maybe picking up after the license was after the RW was issued, or did you contemplate that at all?
You know, there was some discussion around that. I don't recall whether or not there was a consensus on whether we do the 6 years from the time that they got the residential licensure, or whether or not it's all inclusive.
And that would be easier after there's a database where you can report those hours every year, because it will clearly lay out what was residential and what was commercial. So just pondering that in my mind, in the not so distant future, that should suss itself out, because those hours will be reported annually and it'll be clear what was commercial, and you could start counting those hours. But maybe that's where the limited exemption might exist. So some thought around that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if an individual is working for a residential contractor, that it, you know, their primary role is in the residential sector, then when if that individual is still registered as an apprentice, then that contractor should have those same requirements that, hey, if they do go work on a commercial industrial project and they're on that project under their apprentice registration, not under their residential licensure, those hours should be required to be reported to the department so that they can start tracking those hours. You know, and to your point about once you have a database, you can kind of go back and look and say, hey, this individual has been registered as an apprentice for the commercial industrial or a journeyman license, but they're only getting, you know, 40 hours a year under this apprenticeship. So that, you know, that would be a conversation that I think at the time would need to be had. But you know, if the intent of the individual is to stay in the residential sector of the market, then why would they even be registered as, you know, towards their journeyman licensure?
Makes sense. Totally. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Okay, we have another.
And I just really want to really appreciate your feedback on that, Mr. Ross.
Okay. We have a hand raised by Mr. Joel Segura. I'm unmuting your line. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for taking my call here. So I would recommend that the board, if you're looking to implement some rules on what would qualify as an educational exemption, maybe putting 2 failed attempts or a specific number of attempts on the testing. And if they fail 2 or 3 times, whatever that number you come up with, then they could then apply for that exemption. That would be a recommendation for that portion of it. And then if you're gonna look at everything by hours, then maybe they need to have 6 years of equivalent hours that is documented. So instead of just 6 years, maybe they don't get all of those hours that would equal 6 years as an apprentice. So you would actually look at the hours in conjunction with how much time they have to determine whether they would be required to test because of their maybe lack of hours that they get in this field. So those are just a couple of suggestions that I would have.
Thank you. Okay, we have a hand raised by Mr. Rich Thatcher. I'm unmuting your line. Looks like you may be self-muted.
There we go. Just a couple quick observations on some of the comments. And when we verify these 4,000 plus individuals, I would venture to guess we probably should verify that they're actually still working in the field. A lot of people get signed up and then they truly may not be working in the field. When you were talking about make sure all these numbers are good and verified. And the second observation, when we talked about money can't afford, I'm making I guess an assumption here, but I assume all the contractors that I deal with, they pay their employees different versus apprentice versus journeyman's wages. And if that's not the case, I guess that's a bigger issue and a whole nother conversation. And then lastly, from that email produced, in June regarding this information coming up, it must have been a big spam email for everybody with in our industry, apprentices, contractors, because I've gotten a lot of contact from apprentices at 8 years, working in the field, don't have any. They're 288 hours, and they're all of a sudden trying to do their 280 hours real quick to get their journeyman's license before this process. And I'll just make this one statement that a lot of these individuals literally have not bothered getting their license because where they're working hasn't required them. I'm talking about the jurisdiction. And I know some of these individuals are doing work by themselves that literally shouldn't be the case because they don't have their license, and whatever jurisdiction's not checking their licensure. They're just seeing that individuals doing great work, so they've never been called to provide documentation that they've got their license. So but now that they're being forced to it, they're doing it, but only doing it because of these requirements of kind of mandating that, when the reality of it is there probably been some other reasons why they would have got it, because they're doing work in their industry without the license.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like, Joyce, we do have like a lot of written comments, and I don't think that we'll be able to get through them all. So I'm not sure if you want me to read a couple of those or go back to persons with their hands raised.
Definitely the hands raised, and we'll take the written comment. If we run out of the hands raised, we'll go back to the written comment before we're done, but we definitely can take those written comment and provide feedback. Okay, so the next person I show with their hand raised is actually, 1 second. Mr. Richard Hedrick, I'm unmuting your line. Hello?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Richard Hedrick is the owner of US Electric and Communications, but he was unable to attend the meeting, and I'm his HR manager, so I was sitting in. we mostly do residential electrical work, but we do have multifamily projects up in Denver and Longmont, which could be either classified as commercial, but based on the way they're wired, it's residential. But we have guys in Colorado Springs that do single family homes, and they have RW licenses, and every now and then we'll use them up in Denver on those multifamily apartment complexes to help with manpower. But they like to keep their RWs because they work mostly down in the Springs, and they don't plan on getting their journeymans because they're going to stay in that residential area. Are we going to require them being tested along with the apprentices? Because RWs, even though they have a license, they're still under supervision. Do we know how that's going to work? I'm a little new to all this, so I'm just trying to figure out what would be required of our RW licenses.
So if they're doing the residential, obviously there's no reason for them to be registered as an apprentice. And as Mr. Ross had discussed, maybe Mr. Ross, if he wants to respond, as he was part of the legislation, and I'll just fill in, and Elaine, until maybe you can get him engaged. But my understanding is that if they're an apprentice, they should be moving forward for licensure. So when it comes to them doing commercial, if they are going to be doing commercial work, they need to be moving toward licensure as a journeyman, as opposed to staying within the residential. And if they want to just do residential, it does maybe hinder the way you're currently using the apprentice registration. But it seems that is the intent of the statute.
Okay, I show Mr. Ross looks like he has his hand raised and wants to provide comment. I'm unmuting your line.
Yeah, I think that goes along with what we were talking about earlier, right? Where, if they're coming up here, if they're working residential in this case, and they're in the Springs, and their intent is to stay in the residential market, then they would, that's fine, right? There's no requirement to make them move from a residential licensure to the journeyman licensure, unless they're doing work primarily in that role. So if they are if some of their hours every year or whatever are being looked at, and they're being put into the apprentice bucket, then I think they would reach a point where they would have to go and test to be a journeyman. If they're wanting to stay in residential, then that's a decision that they make, right? If you're bringing them up here and having them work on apartments, that's residential work, right? I mean, if they're not to oversimplify it, but if they're running Romex, that's residential work. If they're in downtown Denver doing high rises, that's no longer residential work.
All right, thank you. I have a hand raised by Mr. Bruce Kranick. I'm going to unmute your line.
Yes, hello. Two things I'd like to speak to. Again, this language barrier is huge. The Spanish-speaking plumbers that we hire, and we have a lot of apprentices, and they cannot take the test in English, even if PSL gives them more time, because it's not in Spanish. I wonder if the board can require their third party to require them to have tests in Spanish. That we could have a great path to plumbing residential licenses and journeymen if these fellows could take the test, and they stay perennially as apprentices because of this issue. And then the other thing I wanted to speak to is a lot of folks are wondering about the logic and the reasoning behind this legislation. As president of Plumbing, Heating, Cooling Contractors of Colorado, I would like to say that anybody can contact me at any time and I can fill them in on the logic and the reasoning behind the legislation. And this is a place where we as plumbing and electrical contractors in the state of Colorado need to be paying attention, because once the legislation is passed, it ends up here in DORA, and it's DORA's job to enact the legislation. So there's more legislation that's been introduced this year that is also relevant to plumbing and electrical contractors in Colorado. So if anybody's got any questions there, don't hesitate to give me a call. Thank you.
Thank you. Just scrolling through the list to see if we have any other hands raised. It doesn't look like we have anybody else that wants to speak. So I'll jump back to the comments before we get through a few more comments before we wrap up the stakeholder meeting. We have a question from John Neuerberg. Ever since the change in the required schooling and now this new bill, the electrical field has been losing apprentices to an already depleted field. It seems that all the new requirements are hurting the system that has worked fine for a long time. Dan Hendricks says, although I cannot think of an educational circumstance that would exempt someone from taking the test, proof would be a doctor's diagnosis. Also from Dan Hendricks, we appreciate your work on this webinar. Will there be more to discuss reporting requirements? I can answer that question, yes. And as we wrap up this meeting, we'll go ahead and give you guys the dates of upcoming stakeholder meetings and the tentative schedule for this rulemaking process. Another comment from Mr. John Neuerberg. Is there still an exemption year that a registered apprentice is not required to do the 2-year schooling requirement? Or is there still an exception year that a registered apprentice is not required to do the 2-year schooling requirement? Not sure if you want to weigh in on that, or we can get back to him later. Another comment from Mr. Bruce Kranek, and I think you just echoed this when you were unmuted, but the language barrier is huge. Spanish-speaking plumbers cannot take the test in English, even given more time. The study guides and tests need to be given in Spanish. Comment from Mr. Dan Hendricks. He makes a fine point. So far, we have no legitimate exemptions for education and only one for professional. Exemptions could only be temporary. The requirement is only to take the test, not to pass. That was also from Mr. Dan Hendricks. Mr. Bruce Krennick, can the board require Spanish study guides and tests in Spanish? Ms. Alyssa Soares, I would like to see a professional exemption for folks who only work in residential with their company. We have a number of apprentices who work in the residential department, don't gain commercial hours, and want to stay exclusively in residential. Mr. Dan Hendricks, classes are not required, only a test. He also says, we are not debating the statute here. Sorry, this is a little delayed. Also from Mr. Dan Hendricks, what would be an acceptable financial level? Mr. John Krako, comment, not question. The purpose of a license is to ensure plumbing and electrical is installed safely and properly. The purpose of an apprenticeship is to master these skills in order to accomplish this apprentice. These apprentices are going to have to learn to do it properly. Otherwise, we end up with unsafe installations. In order to work at a profession that requires a license, it is necessary to learn the profession. Comment from Scott Pandy. Not sure what the authors of the bill had intended, but I fear that this will discourage attracting new talent into our industry because of too many rules and costs. Lastly, I can appreciate the situation the board now faces enforcing the bill and appreciate seeking stakeholder input. It's 11 o'clock, Joyce, so, and I want to be mindful of or considerate of everyone's time. So I don't know if you want to keep going. There was only a few more comments left. I don't really see any hands raised. Let me know if you would like.
I think we're good for more comment.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
I think we're good for a few more comments.
Okay. Okay, so I don't show any other hands raised, so we're good there. I'll just read the rest of these written comments. Comment from Jimmy Gill, sorry. Will there be accommodations given the test in Spanish? Will there be Spanish code books? Richard Hendricks, do electrical workers with an RW license be required to take the JW test with the apprentices? Comment from Mr. Sean Mayo. The requirements for licensure is 8,000 hours and 288 education hours, not 4 years. They have not completed their apprenticeship just because they have been in the trade 6 years. Mr. Daniel Lee. Referring from other comments, I understand some guys only ever want to be apprentices, but they should be required. CE. Just as we are required to keep our journeyman and master's license, everyone should be required continuing education and on-the-job training to maintain a license, even if it's just an apprentice card. A lot of companies don't provide or allow employees to gain more knowledge. With it being required, it helps those who work for lesser employers. Looks like Mr. Scott Pandy was just wondering who was currently speaking. That was around 10:41, so I could not answer that question right now. Comment or question from Joyce Cowan. What if the apprentice was registered with another contractor before he came to work for our company? When does the 6 years start? When he was first registered or when he is added to our contractor license? What if there is a gap in his work? He was registered for 1 year, didn't work for 6 months, and then was registered again.
And that is cumulative. So it is for every, it's not for just one contractor, it is for the total time.
Okay, thank you. Comments from Mr. Tony Husky. Could an exemption exist for electrical apprentices that are not in an apprenticeship school program for an educational circumstance if they fail the test twice? Alyssa Soares. Mr. Ross addressed my question. I do like the ideal of case-by-case look at for those primarily working residential, but gaining some one-off commercial hours, exemptions based on the fact that they are only gaining limited commercial hours in that year. They eventually want to get their journeyman their JW, but their primary hours are only coming from residential. Question from Mr. Dan Hendricks. Do we think a 6-year apprentice would meet a certain plus poverty level where they could afford one test every 3 years? Daniel Lee Daniel Lee. I agree with the gentleman speaking. We have a lot of people in the plumbing industry running with the wrong license, owning businesses, and nothing is done about it. Last couple comments. Miss Marilyn Stansbury, thank you for having the stakeholder meeting. We look forward to continuing to work with you. She also says, we will be sharing the link to the webinar recording, or will you be sharing the link to the webinar recording? Yes, the link will be on both the state's electrical board and state plumbing board's web pages under the public notices tab by the end of the day tomorrow. Mr. Jeremy Ross, thanks for everyone's time. Okay, we have gotten through all of the written comments, and I currently don't see any hands raised either. So we could wrap this meeting up. I don't know if you want to take over from here, Darcy, or I could just finalize this.
Sure, I can do that.
Okay.
Joyce, anything else before I close out?
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Alrighty. So thank you for those of you that are still on the meeting. I know we went 5 minutes over, but it was important to read those additional comments. Thank you for participating in today's meeting. As part of this collaborative process, all written comments and feedback received during this meeting will be reviewed by the boards at their next board meetings on March 24th, 2021 for electrical and April 28th, 2021 for plumbing. After the boards have had an opportunity to review and consider stakeholder feedback and develop draft rules, a second stakeholder meeting will be held for stakeholders to provide input on the draft rules. The next stakeholder meeting will be held on April 14th, 2021 for electrical and May 13th, 2021 for plumbing. To correct the erroneous dates referenced on the notice, the tentatively scheduled permanent rulemaking hearing dates are May 26th, 2021 for electrical and June 30th, 2021 for plumbing. And as Elena mentioned, those dates will always be on the website, and we will send blast emails for all of those to all stakeholders in advance of the meeting. That concludes the joint stakeholder meeting, and thank you again for your participation. We're going to end the webinar now.